I've got the wonderful composer Christopher Cerrone here with me, and we're going to have a little conversation about his album, The Arching Path, which is out from Inner Circle Records. This is kind of my latest obsession. I've been listening to it on my nature walks, so the music tends to fit very nicely with the
Oh, I love
sights
that.
and sounds. Yeah. Well, let's talk about the album. These are pieces that you composed between 2010, 2016. So they're pre-existing pieces. They have a little bit of a history to them. Let's start with the title track, The Arching Path, which is inspired by that bridge in Italy, which is like, it's beautiful, it's modernist, but it's kind of terrifying at the same time, you know? Can you talk about how that bridge fits into this music, The Arching Path?
So yeah, I was living in Rome. A lot of this album is very Italy centric, but I was living in Rome on the Rome Prize, and we took a trip to the region of Basilicata, which is it's sort of the deep south of Italy. It's not super developed. It's not super populous. It's not really a tourist location, and we went to this town called Potenza, which is like sort of the big city in that area, and we were advised to check out this bridge. Sort of a side story is that Francis Ford Coppola is from a town called Bernalda, or rather his family is, and so he invested in that region, which is really cool. And the Coppola people sort of recommended we check out this bridge, and so we go to see it, and sort of I'd spent this year sort of like wandering around ruins effectively, and so to have this moment of seeing this sort of sharp architectural modernist object amidst so much sort of history really really struck me. And I was sort of writing this music at the time thinking about sort of very modernistic sort of, it's funny because the term modernist in music sort of implies sort of atonal or dissonant or arrhythmic, and really for me I love modernism, which is to say modernist architecture. I love Frank Lloyd Wright, I love Mies van der Rohe, I love sort of all these wonderful sort of Le Corbusier, all these wonderful artists who are thinking about straight lines and waves. And I walked across this bridge, which is designed by this man named Sergio Musmeci. The first movement is named after him, and it's made out of concrete. And I was so sort of, it's one of those wonderful shock of recognition moments where the music you're working on and the thing you're literally walking through are the same thing. And I was able to sort of take this idea of these sharp lines, these waveforms, and thinking of them as these substrata, as layers of rhythm, eighth notes, dotted eighth notes, and then different polyrhythms, different, like the whole first movement is just sort of these like forms of different layers of rhythm that are sort of put together to create wave like forms. And then as the piece kind of gradually goes on, it gets lower. It starts on the second highest note of the piano, and ends on the highest note of the piano, and it slowly goes down over the course of 5 or 6 minutes until by about minute 6 you're on the lowest C of the piano, and then it kind of moves its way back up. So it's like the movement is one long wave.
Oh, yeah.
And then
Yeah.
I sort of imagine the second movement is looking at the bridge from below. There's a river below it, the Basento River, and so I imagine the repeated notes suddenly became this kind of fast, unmeasured tremolo, which was like sort of thinking about an aqueous sort of flowing sound below it. And so I tried to turn the piano almost into like a synth with all these sustained notes. And then the last moment kind of brings the two elements back together, repeated notes with more sustained material.
Yeah, those repeated notes, especially that start the piece, make me think of like, I thought of a very soft jackhammer, like maybe off in the distance. It has this
That's
kind
so
of
funny.
concrete relationship to it, but it quickly blossoms into, I think, music that is indicative of your sound. I want to talk a little bit about your sound, your approach to writing music. It's hard to pin down composers, and it's even worse to ask them to pin down what their particular sound is. But there's a lot of memory that runs through this piece, music that is associated directly with memories that you've had and that speak to your generation, as it were. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how these particular pieces relate to specific moments in your life. I'm thinking of the self-portrait you did in Double Happiness. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to me because I think, a lot of, for me, the power of music is the power to evoke, the power of memory. I mean, in as much as that, film, theater, music are temporal art forms, I think that fundamentally they're art forms that deal with kind of the act of memory, like actively deal with memory. And so I think with my own work, it's unsurprising then that I should sort of use, memory as a kind of way of activating our own sense of remembrance, because I think that's sort of what music does best. Most people's favorite parts of a musical thing is when the great moment comes in, and it's usually a return, the chorus of a song, or it's sort of, my wife was talking, and I were talking about some, I think it was like literally like "Living on a Prayer" by Bon Jovi or something, and she's like, "Oh, the verse isn't any good." I'm like, "No, the verse is good because it makes you want the chorus to come back." And so, that's how music and memory function. And so, in Double Happiness, it's interesting. It was originally written for electric guitar and percussion, and it was written for like a really great duo based in San Francisco called the Living Earth Show. And then later on, a lot of pianists were sort of calling me, being like, "I love this piece. Can I just arrange it myself?" And I'm like, "Well, no, I don't think that'll be a very good idea." So I just said, "I'll just do it." And so I kind of reimagined the keyboard as a kind of guitar with the pianist plucking harmonics inside the strings. If you touch inside the piano at a certain point, you get a note that's an octave higher, very bell-like. And so I tried to treat the piano as a guitar almost. They literally use guitar picks in the third movement, but then use the resonance of the piano as well. And along with the techniques in this piece from the instruments, it uses field recordings from Italy. I was on another residency in a town called Umbertide in Umbria, which is like sort of, I guess sort of in the eastern center of the country. And I was staying in this castle kind of in the countryside, and I was able to capture the sounds of this town, these incredible rainstorms. It was the end of the summer, and you kind of get this sudden moment. And the host Diego was sort of saying to me, he's like, "Oh, there'll be a big rainstorm, and then it'll be fall." And I'm like, "Well, no, and that's ridiculous." And but it was true, and I caught this rainstorm on my kind of cheap digital recorder that I brought with me. And so that found its way into, the interludes, or these transitions. There are these places that they're interstitial, and I always thought of that rainstorm as this interstitial moment between seasons. And similarly, the third movement uses this amazing bell that the town has. It was the bell for the little tiny train station. It was kind of like a half a real train, and that was sort of the representation of like my heart beating, and excitement and joy. And I mean, the piece tries to ponder melancholy and joy, and sort of the first movement is about melancholy, the third movement is about joy, excitement, anxiety, and they sort of hopefully get synthesized in together in the last moment, which is kind of like a sweet song. It's a song without words, if you will.
Yeah. Well, you also have a song with words on this disc, and this is a song cycle with poetry by, not classic literature like some composers would go for. This is by a young living American composer, Tao Lin. How did you discover his poetry? What drew you to it?
I have a friend who's a poet named Jen Moore, and she was very interested in this work. This was, about 10 years ago, in a movement that was sort of nascent at the time called the New Sincerity, which was an idea of a poetry that returned to kind of like its, sort of direct and sort of simple roots, without kind of being, overwrought in kind of postmodern irony. And so I came across Tao Lin, who is this kind of interesting figure who was in New York based, and very internet based in a lot of ways, very online, continues to be very online. And so, I guess my thought was just that there's something about composers setting really quote unquote unimpeachable texts, things that are perfect, and, more and more now I think this has become common. And, I would hope that this song cycle played a tiny role in this, is that there was a tendency for, when I was in school, for composers to really, it was a tendency to set really classic texts, and I sort of wanted to find something of the now that was sort of reflecting my time in New York, and in the 2010s, and his poetry really fit in perfectly with all these different things, and and it almost has qualities of found objecthood in terms of these kind of like internet phrases, "be right back" and things like that. But it's also really well made and beautiful and honest, and I think it allowed me to access something as a composer myself that worked, I think, quite well. And I have to say that it's probably one of my most performed pieces, and one that I'm like quite precious about. Honestly, I have to say that there were a bunch of recordings made of this piece in different ways. It didn't, they're all done by wonderful singers, but it needed just the right context to record properly. And what we wound up doing is I wound up bringing in Lindsay Kesselman, who's a singer from my prior album, Pieces Fall to Earth, amazing versatile soprano. I brought her on to. Oops, sorry for all this Brooklyn noise. You can tell it's really a little too urban these days. But so I brought on Lindsay onto the project, and we recorded the whole thing. This was the trick, was the entire thing was recorded entirely in isolation. So each player was in a different room, so that you could, it's a funny piece because it seems quite easy and it seems quite straightforward. But it's actually very, very challenging to play perfectly. And so there's so many notes in the piece where the vibraphone and the piano are playing in unison, or the clarinet and the piano are playing at light speed in unison. And it was just the kind of thing where we needed to get this perfect studio treatment where, Ming, who is just a total, like, plays lightning fast on a clarinet on the album, and to get him in a different room than Timo, recorded on a click track, all this stuff where it really just, it took every studio trick possible to get this recording just right. And I'm so happy that we did, because it's really, I don't know, it's a piece that's been floating around for a long time, and one that I'm very proud of. It's probably, and I said one of my most performed pieces, but I just had to get it right and I think I finally did.
Yeah, it's wonderful and wonderful to listen to. You said something that brought up a question for me. You talk about sort of the sparseness of the music and getting it just right. Is that more of a challenge in writing chamber music, because you have so much more in the way of exposed instruments, the way that they fit together? It's not like writing for an orchestra or a string orchestra, is it?
No, it's not. Although I feel like with everything I do, it winds up just being really precise and requires an inordinate amount of precision.
Yeah.
Because I think that when you write simple music, the flaws are more exposed. I think that's just the case, that if you write rhythmic music, if you write sparse music, it's just, if you're not quite right together, and so poor Mike Tierney, who produced this album, was sort of stuck, sort of, just dragging downbeats together for endlessly. And, but I think for me, it's like the thing is just that these projects have really just become their own thing. If you play it live and a couple of notes get shanked here and there, it's like no one's bummed out. But I think that like I think in the case of these projects, I want to find a way to make them perfect, and then and so I think a lot of it involves really moving quite far from traditional performance practice. And in the case of Double Happiness, the first movement, it basically in the score says start at quarter note equals at 40, gradually move up to quarter note equals 70. So, start slow, get a little less slow. But, when doing this in the studio, what I wound up doing is building a click track that went 40, quarter note equals 46, quarter note equals 47, quarter note equals 48. Every single bar is one click faster. Now, you don't hear that when you hear it live. You're just like, oh, that kind of gets going, But I think that the pleasure of me as someone who has grown up with studio recordings, grown up with pop music, grown up with a lot of, idolizing, George Martin and, idolizing the Beach Boys, idolizing these records that are obviously studio objects, that is, something I really wanted to bring into this process to make something that would be impossible live, but, possible in the studio.
Yeah. I know you got to take off soon. I just want to wrap up by asking a little bit about Timo Andres. I love the piano bookends and the way that the first piece, The Arching Path, kind of starts with that little jackhammer or whatever, whatever people think it is. And it ends with a sort of this fade out tinkling of rain, or maybe the train off in the distance. I'm talking about Hoyt Skirmerhorn, which is inspired by that subway stop in Brooklyn. Talk a little bit just about Timo, because I know you guys are very close, and maybe a
Yeah.
little bit about Hoyt Schermerhorn.
Yeah, well, it's funny, and I didn't even think about this, but Arching Path begins with high repeated B, the second highest note of the piece on the piano, and then the ends with a high C repeated highest note on the piano, and Hoyt Schermerhorn ends with the high B and C. So it might be nothing more than my preoccupation with extreme registers, which I think is under. I think the highest octave of the piano is deeply underrated. My piano tuner might feel otherwise. So yeah, Timo's one of my dearest and oldest friends. We met in our first semester together at Yale. We were the two master students that year. In 2007. So I guess we've been friends for like almost 14 years now. And he was just this kind of really really wonderful person. And, he was sort of his reputation preceded him in a certain way, as he was this kind of already formidable pianist and composer, and I was very intimidated by him, but it turned out he was a nicest guy and a sweetheart and loved playing new music. So he sort of we wound up becoming close. He wound up playing a bunch of my music, and then through kind of circumstance of us both graduating around the same time from school, we wound up living together in Brooklyn. So we had a really intense period of living in a tiny flat in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, and it was a tiny apartment, which was then even rendered tinier by his grand piano in the living room, which he was kind enough to let me use all the time, and it's a beautiful old Bosendorfer from the 20s. But yeah, Timo and I are, I'm literally have to jet from this interview to go have a rehearsal with Timo, because I have a new piece for cello and piano for the cellist in Balsegev, and we both involved Timo in the project because she's a close collaborator of his as well. And so, I think he's part of a close circle of composers and performers that I keep, that I think is, it's really like a family of, if it's part family, part critics, part friendship, part, well, I guess it's sort of all those things. And I think that, to me, and I sort of, emphasize this with my students when I, teach, is that, these people who you stumble upon in your school and your class are going to be your collaborators for the rest of your life, the cool ones. And so, keep them close. And the whole thing, that, really everyone on this album is like a really, really close collaborator with whom, the relationships go much deeper than just, performance. But, Lindsay is... Lindsay stayed on my couch when, she recorded this album because she was coming out from North Carolina. We hung out a lot, and we've hung out a ton, and she's someone who I love working with. And Ian is just he's sort of like a brother of mine, and he's, I think that none of them accept the first draft, I'd say, from me, and they all want better, and they all want me to do, they accept their role as collaborators, and I think that that's underspoken about. I think that a lot of performers and composers think that you just turn over a score and you learn it, and and I think with someone who's new to working with me, I'm like, no, this is just a draft. You need to tell me what doesn't work. I'll fix it, but you need to be in on the process. And so really, and same thing with Ming. When I was writing the clarinet part for this piece, he's like, well, this is the hardest B flat clarinet part of all time, or the easiest A clarinet part of all time, so let's do that. And I said, great, thank you for getting involved. And that's Ming also happens to be a stunningly good cook of Chinese food, which I'm slowly apprenticing in the practice. So all I can say is that this album is born out of, I think, a lot of love, and I think it shows. I think it shows in the final result.
Absolutely shows. Well, the best thing for folks to do is to get the album and listen to it. Christopher Cerrone is the composer of The Arching Path, a collection of works that's released from Inner Circle Records. Thanks so much for talking about it with us here on FM 91. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Brad.